Two riders moved along an old forest road, covered in mud and slush. Their horses struggled to navigate the washed-out path, slipping with each step. Around them stretched a grim forest, with trees looming over the road as if ready to swallow any creature daring to pass through. A heavy mist crept along the ground, hiding the potholes and puddles that constantly ensnared the horses' hooves. Leading the way was a young man named Godwin, a hunter surrounded by dark rumors. He was of middle age, with a dusky face framed by long black hair streaked with gray, held back by a braided headband. Godwin was of average height, not particularly broad-shouldered, but lean and agile, with a piercing gaze from his sharp gray eyes and a stern line of thin lips. His reputation preceded him. He always hunted alone and was known for his strength and mercilessness towards his enemies. Godwin was both feared and respected as the most dangerous and mysterious hunter of werewolves, vampires, and other dark creatures. Beside him rode a young man named Kyle, a novice from the Holy Brotherhood and apprentice to the most ruthless inquisitor, Michael. He had been specifically assigned to the hunter to expose him as a sorcerer using abominable spells. Kyle was very young, thin, with red hair and clear blue eyes. His clothes were soaked and dirty from the long journey, but a small amulet, the symbol of his faith, shone with purity. He was confident in his mission, although the journey with Godwin had begun to unravel his previous beliefs. For several days, they had been heading towards the border between the lands of humans and the magical folk on a mission from the Hunters Guild. Kyle was to uncover the truth about the hunter, and Godwin was to eliminate a new threat that had appeared in these lands. Kyle felt the cold seeping through his clothes but showed no sign of discomfort. He knew his task was not easy, and every moment spent next to Godwin could be his last. Nevertheless, he continued on, determined to see his mission through to the end, despite all doubts and fears. The forest gradually thinned out, and as they emerged from the thicket, the travelers encountered a mounted patrol. The captain of the unit, seeing them on the empty road leading away from the forest, rode up, glanced at the guild's insignia, and nodded in greeting. "Good morning, Hunter," he said, rising slightly in his stirrups and scrutinizing Kale. "Any problems, Captain?" Godwin inquired. "People are disappearing from the town and surrounding villages," the captain replied curtly, giving them a keen look. "Have the hunters checked it out?" the man asked cautiously, his gray eyes flashing. "Yes," the soldier nodded affirmatively. "Two teams were here not long ago. They searched but found nothing, moved on to the outskirts, the villages, and the town of Adin, which is 2 days' journey from here." "And what were the results? Did they find anything?" Godwin squinted, pondering the words. "Apparently, nothing. They haven't returned, likely continued directly," the captain shrugged. Commanding his unit to move on, he called back, "So, Hunter, it's probably bandits. Be careful." After the conversation, Godwin became silent and thoughtful, irritably brushing off Kyle's burning curiosity. The young man was eager to learn more about both the hunters and the creatures they faced. Disheartened, Kale sank into his own thoughts. Godwin was clearly more than just a hunter. There was something unusual about him. But Kale had yet to find direct evidence that he was a sorcerer, so he couldn't assert it with certainty. And after spending these days in his company, the young man had begun to see magic in a different light. He started to understand that evil in its essence lies not in the ability to wield a rare power, but in human hearts themselves, something his mentors had said, but they had attributed a different meaning to it. According to them, sorcerers and all magical beings were inherently dark, with no choice about which side they took. However, having a gift did not make one a bloodthirsty sorcerer. For that, one needed a soul that took pleasure in violence against defenseless victims. This is what Kyle meant when he said they were worse than beasts. These creatures could act no other way, while humans made a choice on how to use their abilities. Everything seemed clear, but how could he explain this to Master Michael? The redhead sighed sadly and shook his head. Besides, if his mentor had indeed sent him on a mission where he was meant to perish, to then accuse Godwin of his death, he might not have to report anything. Even now, Kale felt that if he had a choice, he would prefer the company of hunters, despised by the Holy Brotherhood, over returning to the sanctuary. Lost in such thoughts, the day passed unnoticed, and Godwin commanded a halt. While the novice gathered firewood, the hunter busied himself with something near his horse. When the cheerful tongues of flame started flickering over the dry wood, and Kyle, anticipating rest, sat down next to the spread blankets, Godwin removed a long bundle from his saddle, which thudded dully. "Get up," he ordered, handing the novice a wooden sword. The young man stared in astonishment at the offered item, then stubbornly shook his head. "No way. An inquisitor doesn't need contemptible steel." He wasn't seriously trying to defend himself with this argument, but nothing else came to the shocked novice's mind. "Don't be ridiculous. Don't your inquisitors carry swords?" Godwin tossed the training blade next to the young man. "What will you do if you encounter a beast and can't even hold a dagger? Scream and run?" "I have the holy word." The young man didn't believe his own words, but he was very reluctant to learn weapon skills. Kale yelped more from surprise than pain when an identical blade in the hunter's hand slapped him flat on the thigh with a loud smack, making him jump. "Ouch! Why?" the young man began to say. But a new strike, this time with the edge on his calves, made him gasp in pain and awkwardly try to dodge to the side. "Take the sword and defend yourself," Godwin advanced on the novice, narrowing his eyes. The redhead shook his head again, retreating backward, receiving a few more hits. One on the shoulder, another on his already sore buttocks, just starting to get used to the saddle, before finally grabbing the wooden sword and awkwardly trying to fend off the stinging blows. "Oh, I see you've practiced on the highway," the hunter remarked mockingly. "Why are you holding the sword like a bandit with a club?" "It's a club," the boy retorted, holding the blade out in front of him. Godwin lowered his sword. "Widen your stance. You're standing like you're at a ball. Right foot forward." He lightly tapped the shin with the tip of his sword, adjusting the stance. "Relax your wrists. Straighten your back. It should be rigid. Hands at chest level, don't let your elbow droop. Move, strike, and don't make such a ridiculous face." Godwin tormented the novice for what seemed like 2 hours, starting with the basics. Body positioning, primary defensive stance, and proper footwork. But Kale felt as if he had run the entire distance they had traveled today, chasing after the horses. Exhausted and drenched in sweat, he cursed the hunter with every endearing word he knew, and went to wash off the dirt in a small, merrily babbling brook. Godwin, watching the disheveled and grumbling youth go, threw a handful of pleasantly scented herbs into the boiling water in the pot. The boy definitely had potential. He instinctively sensed the weapon, and more importantly, the opponent. He could succeed if only he wasn't so stubborn and argumentative over every little thing. The hunter frowned. He remembered telling his late friend, the hunter Robert, that he'd rather hang himself than take on an apprentice, to which his friend had laughed and said that he just hadn't found someone he wanted to teach everything to. It seemed his friend was right, as always. Kale, shivering but dressed in clean clothes, returned to the campsite to find the stern hunter with a somewhat bewildered but bright smile on his thin lips. A while later on the road. At first it became noticeably colder, and soon the wind picked up. The light mist that had previously lain like a weightless shroud on the ground was mercilessly torn to shreds by the gusts of cold air. The leaden gray clouds that had been a mere speck on the horizon now loomed threateningly overhead within a quarter of an hour. The belly of the purplish monster rumbled dully, and blinding flashes of lightning streaked across its billowing hide. The wind grew stronger, howling like a wounded beast. The trees along the road trembled fearfully and bent under the onslaught of the passing squalls. Neither the warm vests under their linen shirts nor the heavy cloaks they wrapped themselves in provided any protection. The furious gusts of harsh wind seemed to come from all directions, tearing the hoods off the wayfarers caught in the storm. Kyle discreetly wiped his tear-filled eyes, stung by the wind, and tucked his chilled hands into the folds of his cloak. His docile but rather sluggish mare couldn't keep up with Godwin's ever-accelerating black horse. The hunter himself, though squinting, didn't look as miserable as the novice, who resembled a frozen, ruffled sparrow. "Hurry up," the man called back. "A heavy rain is coming. We need to find shelter." He pointed to the sharp rooftops of houses visible in the distance. Kyle smiled with relief and spurred his horse into a heavy gallop. The horses thundered into the city at full speed, their hooves clattering on the cobblestone streets. The guards at the entrance didn't stop the strangers racing by, but didn't even peek out from their post, intimidated by the storm. The first few heavy raindrops began to hit the tiled roofs tentatively, gaining confidence with each moment. By the time Godwin and Cale rode under the sloping roof of the nearest inn and dismounted, handing their reins to a stable boy who, strangely, didn't even wait for a coin for his service, a torrential downpour had turned the city streets into a solid gray wall. The thunder rumbled just as fiercely, illuminating the now ominous silhouettes of buildings in flashes of ghastly blue light, and the hunter and novice hurried into the warmth of the tavern. Kyle looked around in amazement. He was used to the monotony of inns, some cleaner, some dirtier, but all essentially the same. This one, however, was drastically different from any he had seen before. Everything here was impeccably clean. Polished dishes behind the counter gleamed, reflecting the light from bright oil lamps hung on the walls. Paintings adorned the neat, whitewashed walls. The oak tabletops stood on ornate carved legs. The stairs to the second floor, leading to the guest rooms, were made of some light wood, its railing also decorated with carvings. Even the patrons behaved differently from what the novice was used to. Everyone sat, conversing quietly and politely, with no drunken shouts, crude jokes, or gambling, let alone harassing the comely serving girls. The red-headed youth turned to the hunter, intending to express his admiration, but said nothing upon seeing the look of disdain on his companion's handsome face. "Like a brothel," Godwin diagnosed. And the boy, who had, of course, never been to a den of sin, began to look around with renewed curiosity, trying, however, to do so discreetly. "That's quite an unflattering review," a low, velvety voice said, and Cale once again found his mouth agape. A woman approached them. She was not very tall, but had a full bust, large blue eyes skillfully made up, plump red lips, and wavy jet-black hair that cascaded over her shoulders. She was dressed in a long gown with a plunging neckline that left little to the imagination but made it impossible for any man to look away. "Definitely a brothel," the hunter snorted, his face twisting as if in pain, snapping the boy's jaw shut with a flick. Cale closed his mouth with a click and looked at Godwin resentfully. "I take it you need rooms?" the proprietress inquired, choosing to ignore the blatant rudeness. The hunter nodded affirmatively. "A gold coin for 2 rooms and 20 silver if you want a bath," the woman said with a charming smile. Cale looked at her in bewilderment. Either the other inns charged double, or this one was running at a loss. The hunter silently took out the coins from his purse and handed them to the innkeeper. "Would you like dinner served now or later?" the woman inquired. "Later," Godwin replied, grabbing the novice by the sleeve and practically dragging him to their allocated rooms. This time, Cale finished much quicker than his companion, and descending the stairs, had to wait quite a while, swallowing hungrily and inhaling the aromas wafting from the kitchen. When Godwin finally deigned to appear, the boy was visibly irritated and angry. Seeing the boy's twisted face, the hunter raised an eyebrow in surprise, calmly sat across from him, and their ordered meal, placed by Cale half an hour earlier, was promptly brought to their table. Godwin, observing the boy intently chewing, frowned. He didn't just dislike it here. His intuition screamed of danger, yet his eyes stubbornly refused to notice anything suspicious. This lack of clarity unsettled the hunter. As soon as they entered the city, he felt an alien and hostile force touch his mind, as if studying it. Tormented by uncertainty, the man disregarded all precautions and pulled out the amulet from under his shirt, carefully squeezing it in his hand and narrowing his eyes, which glinted with silver. And everything around him changed. The tidy tavern was now a dilapidated building with rotting logs in the walls, broken and haphazardly piled tables, collapsed floors on the second level, and slimy residue on the cracked window frames. The people looked like corpses, each with thin strands of cobweb-like strings stretching to them, wrapping them like marionettes. Godwin saw this clearly. A nearly transparent string tightened slightly, and the merchant at the neighboring table raised his head and smiled, saying something to his companions. Everything around was nothing more than an expertly crafted material illusion. The hunter shuddered, realizing what they had stumbled into. Cale looked at the suddenly tense hunter in surprise. "What's wrong? Is something amiss?" "Listen to me carefully." Godwin's voice rang with tension. "Go up to your room now and stay there. Don't leave, no matter what or who comes for you, even if all seven themselves appear and invite you to the heavenly halls." "All right." The boy nodded obediently, sensing in his gut that they were in serious trouble. "Take this." The hunter unexpectedly twisted off his guild ring and handed it to the novice. "Don't take it off until I tell you." The boy nodded, put the ring on his finger and went upstairs, watched closely by the hunter. Godwin, ensuring the stubborn boy wouldn't disobey, slowly stood, donned his cloak, and left the tavern. The rain had almost stopped, only a few drops sliding down the dense fabric of the cloak like transparent crystals. But the sky was overcast, making the night even darker. The hunter quickly walked along the cobbled streets, following the ghostly threads. Sometimes, laughing couples passed by him, flickering light visible in the windows, but Godwin saw what lay beneath the mask. The city was dead. Long dead and hopelessly so. Many houses were completely ruined, with remnants of walls jutting toward the sky. Potholes gaped in the cobblestone streets. Some buildings were already covered in moss and entwined with wild ivy. And the remains of former life were ensnared in a giant web of dreams, thin, silvery threads gently swaying in the wind. Another step, and the town square of Adin unfolded before the hunter, with the Temple of the Seven at its center. The pointed towers had crumbled, piercing the dark sky with silent reproach. The statues of the gods, cracked and darkened, gazed silently at the person who dared to break the long-established silence of this place. Godwin blinked and followed the cobwebs, which streamed like a river from all over the city into the gaping doorway of the temple. Stepping over the scattered stones in his path, he slowly entered the building and stood in astonishment. What he saw inside did not match the grim spirit of desolation and decay reigning in the streets of Adin. Weightless lace shimmered under the translucent light of the emerging moon, creating an intricate canopy of exquisite patterns formed by thin threads. The entire temple, up to the cracked altar, was draped in a funerary veil of unseen beauty. Droplets of moisture trembled like tears on the silvery lines, easily sliding and freezing again, making the surrounding space sparkle with a crystalline light. "You found me, Hunter. I am surprised," a bewitching voice sang, resonant like a mountain stream. Kyle sat in his room, bored and curious, examining the ring on his finger. The stone was a sapphire, dark and seemingly glowing faintly from within. It bore Godwin's insignia, a star of an unusual yet vaguely familiar shape. Tiring of inspecting what he considered a trinket, the novice rummaged through his bag and pulled out his travel notes, intending to make good use of his time. However, his thoughts refused to cooperate, and only mischievous blots dripped from the sharpened quill's tip. Moreover, he was constantly annoyed by cobwebs tickling his face and temples. The boy brushed them away, wiped his cheeks with his hands, and shook his head. But the cursed spider seemed to sit right on top, laughing slyly as it threw thread after thread. This was incredibly irritating, and the boy, growling, grabbed a book and jumped onto the bed. Strangely enough, the cobwebs stopped bothering him, and the redhead gladly immersed himself in his notes. He had barely written a couple of lines when there was a knock at the door. Cale remembered Godwin's instructions, confirmed that there had been no mention of not letting anyone in, and shouted, "Come in!" It may be the landlady of the inn. Memory and consciousness drifted away into the ensuing darkness. Godwin stood silently, looking at the unexpected interlocutor. To say she was beautiful was an understatement. In this case, human standards and notions of beauty ceased to mean anything because some things in this world defy any description. She was incredibly, inhumanly beautiful. A perfect body with skin that gleamed with a matte velvet glow under the light of droplets, a finely chiseled face and graceful head, enormous bright eyes with golden sparks in their depths, and a cascade of white hair like freshly fallen snow cascading over her slender form. She was a dark high witch, but not just any witch, a witch vampire who knew spider magic, a very rare form of sorcery. "How did you manage to see through my illusion, mortal?" She slid gracefully off the broken altar. "Tell me, I am eager to know." "You did quite a job." The hunter's voice was utterly calm and indifferent, which greatly surprised the beauty. "You look at me differently, not like ordinary people." She charmingly furrowed her thin eyebrows. "It feels like you're used to this kind of thing." She slowly and gracefully ran her hand along her body, casting a passionate glance at the motionless man from beneath half-lowered, trembling lashes. "Do you think you're the first vampire I've encountered?" Godwin wrinkled his nose, tilting his head. "Why did you destroy this entire town?" "Destroyed?" The vampire lightly ran her fingers along a trembling thread. "I gave them a perfect life. Look, there is no place here for bitterness, pain, or bloody conflicts. Isn't that what they dream of? Death and desolation. That's your idea of their deepest desires," Godwin sneered. "Just like all dark creatures." "You're strange, Hunter," she smiled, revealing even teeth. "Mortals' reactions to everything seen here are always the same. They can't understand beauty. Their desires narrow down to only two: possess or destroy. And people don't even realize that this is the main reason for our hatred of them. Who are you?" "You don't need to know." The hunter stepped back slightly from the approaching vampire. "Maybe you're just another toy of the light ones." Her beautiful face twisted into a contemptuous grimace for a moment. "They love luring handsome mortals into their traps. 5 of your fellow hunters. They came to catch a monster and met me. They didn't even understand what happened, fools. But your appearance wavers before my eyes. It's so similar to my illusion, isn't it, mortal? Anyway, you have no idea who you've encountered today." And the vampire gracefully glided toward the hunter. "Aye shun say Tillin." The words in the witch's language melodiously slipped from his lips, and the name sounded just as it should, the light ring of fine cobweb threads under the touch of the wind. In human language it meant, "I know who you are, Tillin." The vampire witch's beautiful eyes widened in shock. "You speak our language, mortal? Impossible. How did you learn my name?" "I like to surprise, Spider." Godwin grinned, and his sword slid from its scabbard with a quiet, menacing hiss, runes flaring to life. "Enchanter? This should be interesting." The vampire witch smoothly stepped aside as if she flowed. "May I invite an audience?" The temple doors swung open, and in the circle of light outlined by the high windows appeared Kyle. The boy's eyes were completely vacant, his movements jerky and uneven, as if he had suddenly become a puppet. "Damn it," the hunter hissed quietly. "He resisted for a long time," the witch mused, twirling a lock of hair around her finger. "He brushed off my threads like annoying flies. At first I didn't understand how he managed it, but now I see you gave him protection. And his soul is so bright, so pure. I can sense his blood is delicious." The vampire witch demonstratively licked her lips, running her tongue over her elongated fangs. "If I add a bit of fear and despair, it will be absolutely exquisite." She snapped her thin fingers, and Cale's eyes regained their awareness, his limbs obeying him once more. "Godwin." Cale stared at the hunter in astonishment, then admiringly at the woman. "Who is she?" "Your dream," sensual lips whispered softly, and threads of the web darted toward the boy, transforming mid-air into a terrifying, sharp weapon that could easily pierce through stone boulders. Cale didn't even have time to comprehend how close he came to death at that moment. A strong push knocked him off his feet, causing him to fall painfully onto the marble floor covered in stone chips, hitting his knees hard. Hearing a plaintive clink, he began to blink rapidly to clear the dust from his eyes and lifted his head. In the spot where he had just stood, Godwin hung lifelessly in the web's grasp, a crimson stain spreading under his heart, coloring his shirt a bluish hue in the night's gloom. His sword lay forlornly a few steps away. "How touching?" The vampire witch shook her head. "Is he your apprentice? You care for him so much that you sacrificed your pathetic life for him? I was hoping for some grand entertainment. How boring." The boy started trembling. Slipping, he jumped to his feet and rushed to the lifeless hunter, but a flexible web strand wrapped around his neck, pulling him away from Godwin. "That's so touching!" The High Witch slashed the air with her hand, transforming before his eyes. In an instant, a grotesque creature appeared before the boy. Bony, long legs ending in clawed paws, thin, sinewy arms with steel claws hanging almost to its knees, sunken flanks and protruding ribs, a terrifying, snarling face with a massive mouth full of needle-sharp fangs. "You haven't won yet," Godwin croaked, spitting out blood that filled his mouth. There was a soft click, and the hunter's belt unfurled into a flexible, sharpened spring that, like a whip, lashed toward the stunned witch, easily slicing through the silvery steel threads. The vampire shrieked in rage, lunging at the hunter and releasing the choking novice. Cale coughed convulsively, collapsed to his knees, and hurriedly crawled away. Godwin somersaulted, releasing the whip belt, grabbed his sword, and springing from the floor, deflected the sharp claw's strike, while simultaneously throwing one of his discs. The vampire witch screeched angrily, easily dodging the near miss of death, but momentarily distracted, allowing the hunter to leap forward and slash at the exposed foe. The witch released the threads, knocking aside the blade aimed at her chest and causing Godwin to twist and jump back to avoid the webbing that cut through the floor like paper. Landing lightly, the hunter tried to throw a second disc, but the vampire snagged his left arm, wrapped it in a thread, and yanked him back, causing him to lose balance. Godwin toppled backward, falling onto his back, as the witch loomed over him, raising her clawed hand for the final strike. Cale saw something spark and click loudly in the darkness of the vaults, and a silver bolt whizzed through the air, striking the vampire's back. The high witch gasped and arched in pain. Godwin kicked her away from himself and, without hesitation, decapitated her with one swift motion. The headless body, bleeding silver blood, collapsed at his feet, dissolving like mist, its shimmering edges drawn into the still exposed amulet. "Get up," Godwin said sharply and strangely, picking up the disc that had earlier fallen to the floor with a clang and returning it to its scabbard. The sword's crossguard already gleamed over his shoulder. Kyle got to his feet, struggling to stand on his trembling legs. His heart still pounded like mad. With shaking hands, he tried to brush the dust off his clothes and heard a quiet, muffled groan. He turned instantly to see Godwin slowly sinking to the floor. His shirt was soaked in blood, a thin stream of it trickling from his mouth, dropping heavily from his chin. The novice rushed to the hunter, ducking under his arm and trying to pull him to his feet. Godwin was surprisingly light, which surprised the red-haired boy. The man struggled to straighten his legs and whispered, "Take my belt." "What? To hell with that, we need to—" The boy trembled. Godwin stubbornly shook his head, and the novice, trying to support the leaning hunter, picked up the gleaming whip from the floor, immediately cutting his hands on it. With stiff fingers, the man pressed the engraving, and the silver snake coiled into a tight ball, hiding its cutting edges. When they emerged from the temple, Cale was overwhelmed with despair. The illusion covering the dead city had vanished, and before the boy's eyes stood only the ghost of a once lively town, now staring into eternity with the emptiness of black sockets. But what scared him most was the hunter's labored breathing, with each moment leaning more heavily on the proffered shoulder. Blood didn't stop, marking their path with crimson splotches. The ruins of the inn, where they had left their horses and belongings, were still far off. So he couldn't believe his eyes at first when he saw a large, dark silhouette approaching them, and recognized Godwin's stallion. The black horse jerked its head sharply, turning its right side to the novice. The boy understood what the intelligent animal wanted, but he couldn't lift an adult man, even a relatively light one, onto the back of the large horse alone. The stallion, as if comprehending this, bent its front legs, kneeling, and then lay down completely. With difficulty, he managed to get the nearly unconscious hunter onto the horse. Kyle waited until the pale fingers slowly gripped the horse's thick mane and then stepped back. But the horse continued to lie there, its enormous golden eyes strangely gleaming. The boy hesitantly approached and carefully sat behind the man, holding him steady. The black horse rose smoothly, not like an ordinary horse, only slightly swaying its riders, and moved silently down the street. Kyle stared in amazement at the remains of buildings passing by in complete silence. Less than 5 minutes later, the horse was already standing near the ruins of the inn, tapping its hoof impatiently, urging the boy to hurry. The horse's left shoulder glistened oddly, like oil. When the novice realized it was Godwin's blood, he jumped off the horse and ran for their belongings. Opening the cracked door hanging on one hinge, Kyle recoiled and nearly vomited. The hall was strewn with bodies. Some grinned with the white bones of skeletons, others emitted the horrific stench of rotting flesh. Holding his nose, the boy flew up the stairs, dangerously balancing on the nearly collapsed steps, frantically grabbed their bags, and rushed back, nearly tumbling down the stairs and raising a new wave of stench. A gulp of fresh air cleared his head. He dashed into the stable, driving his bay gelding out of the rotten stall. The furious neighing made him flinch. The black horse spun in place, pawing at the ground and flashing its eyes ready to bolt. Praying to the seven that he understood the frantic horse correctly, the boy mounted again, pressing the unconscious Godwin against the horse's neck and gripping the mane tightly. And the horse took off. The spirit of the wind stormed ahead, bending the grass but not touching the ground, making the trees tremble. Everything turned into one continuous dark streak, and Cale closed his eyes, silently moving his lips in desperate prayer to the all-benevolent gods for the dying hunter who had saved his life at the cost of his own. They covered the 3-day distance in a few hours. However, those hours stretched into an eternity for Kyle. He felt the heart under his hands beating slower, the blood flowing through the dying hunter's veins more sluggishly and reluctantly. In the red-haired boy's disheveled head, one desperate thought pounded. Just make it. Just make it. The black horse flew silently through the sleeping streets of the city and crashed through the heavy lock on the gates. In the yard, a watchdog barked itself hoarse, and a faint, flickering light appeared in the window. "Marne!" the boy shouted desperately, sliding off the horse's back, noticing that there was neither sweat nor foam on its flanks, which always accompanied a wild gallop. The first to rush out onto the porch was Annabelle, hair loose, in her nightgown, holding a bronze candlestick with a melting candle. She screamed in fright at the sight of Kyle, who with bloody hands was trying to pull the limp Godwin off the horse. She hastily placed the light on the dark planks and rushed to help. A moment later, the healer Marne appeared, hastily tying her upper shirt. She raised her hands to her face, flinching but quickly pulled herself together, pushed Annabelle away from Godwin and commanded, "Bring hot water." The girl looked at Marne with uncomprehending eyes. Then her gaze cleared, and she silently ran to the kitchen. The healer slapped the horse on the back, and the spirit of the wind obediently lay down, allowing them to pull the hunter off. Together with Cale, they dragged the man into the house and laid him on a bed. The boy looked in despair at Godwin's sharp features. His breathing was wheezy, intermittent, barely lifting his chest. Marne grabbed a knife, mercilessly ripped open the shirt soaked in sticky liquid, and gasped. "Who hurt him so badly?" "A vampire," the boy said, almost in tears, battling the horror swelling in his heart at the sight before him. A wide, ragged wound gaped on the hunter's chest, broken ribs jutting out like sharp fangs. A vampire? What kind of vampire could do this to him? This isn't like him. It must have been a special, very strong vampire, the healer grumbled, deftly treating the wound. "He was saving me too," Cale whispered bitterly, and suddenly started crying like a small child. "No point in shedding tears here," the healer said gruffly, but her voice softened immediately. "Be proud, boy. He would only have done that for Robert in the past." Marne bustled around the lying man incessantly. Kyle could hardly understand what the woman was doing. He just watched the hunter and tried to comprehend why this mysterious man had sacrificed so much for him. A clumsy novice of the Holy Order. The boy's gaze slid to the amulet lying freely on Godwin's chest. As if sensing the attention, the thin threads inside the circle twitched slightly, and crimson droplets began to slowly glide along the web, captivating and mesmerizing. Cale's mouth fell open in amazement at the animated object. Then he felt a sharp push and, as if waking up, looked bewilderedly at the angry healer. "Get out!" She pushed the resisting Cale out of the room. "Wash up and try to sleep. There's nothing more you can do here." And she slammed the door in his face. The novice stepped aside to let Annabelle with the hot water pass and trudged downstairs. "You've gone mad, fool!" Marne scolded the unconscious Godwin. "You nearly enchanted the boy, idiot!" Annabelle looked at the woman in surprise and silently set the bucket down beside the bed. "How is he?" she asked quietly. "Not good." A deep frown etched on the healer's forehead. "I'm afraid he won't survive the night." The girl lowered her head, trying to hide the tears welling up in her eyes. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Yes." Marne turned to her, dipping clean cloths into the hot water. "Go and calm the boy. He might do something reckless out of despair." Annabelle nodded, casting a long, thoughtful glance at the hunter, and then left, quietly closing the door behind her. Cale sat on the porch, staring blankly into the clear night's darkness. Memories of the battle in the dead town flashed before his eyes repeatedly. Each time a wave of guilt surged from the depths of his soul, twisting like a knife in his heart. And he kept wondering, would anyone from the Order have done the same for him? A warm hand on his shoulder distracted him from his sorrowful thoughts. "Go to sleep." Annabelle gently stroked his red curls. "Marne said he'll be all right." Cale exhaled shakily, feeling the iron claws of fear unclench from his soul. Smiling, he headed to his room. The girl stood on the porch for a moment, closing her eyes and letting the cool breeze wash over her flushed face, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart before returning inside. 2 hours later, Marne finished her work. With her shoulders drooping in exhaustion, she instructed Annabelle to stay by Godwin's side and dragged herself to her own room, barely able to lift her feet. Annabelle quietly stroked the man's thin fingers, occasionally touching his gaunt face and running her fingers along his cool cheek. After ensuring for about an hour that his breathing, though faint and irregular, remained steady, she stood up, drew Godwin's thin dagger from its sheath, and ran it across the base of her palm. Clenching the cut, she leaned over and, pulling back the blanket, drew an intricate symbol on Godwin's left shoulder with her blood. Then, hesitating a moment, she drew the same symbol on her right shoulder and with clenched fists slipped under the covers beside him. The man awoke just before dawn. His head spun, and his chest felt like it was pierced by a steel rod. He struggled for a long time to open his eyes, trying to make out his surroundings through the blur that felt like sand in his eyes. When he finally managed to focus, he realized he was at Marne's, and a faint smile touched his lips despite himself. The boy hadn't been scared, hadn't abandoned him, and had helped. Godwin felt as though he was lying next to an open flame. He glanced sideways and tried to pull away, but found Annabelle lying beside him, softly breathing in his ear. But his body felt like lead. His arms wouldn't obey, and any attempt to move made his vision darken with searing pain in his chest. The girl stirred and snuggled closer to the hunter, who gritted his teeth. Godwin groaned softly, realizing he was losing control of both himself and the cursed amulet, which had fully activated. Strength, like a slow but steady stream, began to return to the hunter, who cursed through his teeth. Annabel sleepily lifted her head, looked at the waking man, saw the glowing symbol she had drawn on his shoulder, and smiled contentedly. The next morning, Cale, barely opening his eyes, leapt from his bed and rushed to Godwin's room. Halfway there, near the living room, he heard commotion, groans, muffled curses, and annoyed hissing. Bursting through the door, the boy broke into a joyful grin. A bandaged Godwin was cursing as he fended off the astonished Marne's attempts to examine him. Due to his weakness, his efforts were feeble, and soon he was caught, seated on a chair and thoroughly inspected. Shooting a sidelong glance at the bewildered healer and the beaming boy, the hunter clearly felt out of place. "Godwin," the boy said, hanging his head guiltily as he approached the man after Marne, satisfied with her examination, left the room. "I'm sorry. I behaved like an idiot back then and only got in the way." The hunter snorted and winced slightly from the pain. "It's all right. Now you understand why I started teaching you." Cale nodded enthusiastically. Godwin smiled, and as he stood up, he ruffled the boy's red hair. The door banged against the frame. The healer rushed at the stunned hunter and slapped him hard. "What did you do to the girl, you idiot?" Her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists, and fear filled her eyes. Godwin first pressed his hand to his burning cheek in bewilderment. Then his eyes widened, and he groaned, clenching his fist to his forehead. Grimacing from the pain caused by the sudden movement, he followed Marne at a run. The confused boy trailed after them. Annabel sat on the bed in her small room, dreamily staring at the ceiling. Her eyes shone, but she seemed not to be there, lost in her own reverie. When Godwin and Marne entered the room, Annabel remained indifferent to everything happening around her, like a living doll. Cale stared in bewilderment at the sudden change that had come over her in just one night. Godwin, looking desperately at the girl, knelt before her, forcing her to look at him. "Annabel, do you hear me?" She focused her gaze on the man, but she had a blank stare, still continuing to look somewhere without moving or saying a word. "Cale, get out!" the hunter suddenly barked, and the boy darted out of the room before he realized what he was doing. The door slammed behind him, and he leaned against the wall, not daring to go back. "What is this?" Marne asked quietly, watching Godwin frown and bite his lips in hesitation. "She performed an enhanced magic ritual of bonding with me, a ritual of assistance," he whispered. "Meaning she transferred her life force to you. Last night. How did she know about it?" The healer shook her head in sorrow. "And she's enchanted because of your amulet?" Godwin nodded silently. "I couldn't hold back because I was unconscious and dying," he said, his thin lips twisting bitterly. "And the amulet couldn't maintain the illusion. And now what?" Marne furrowed her brows in anger. "Undo it. I can't stand to see her as a lifeless doll." "I can't," Godwin's voice cracked. "I don't care if you can or not," the healer leaned closer to the hunter. "Just do it. Bring her back to the way she was before you clouded her mind." And she left, closing the door behind her. Kyle tried to rush into the room, but she grabbed him by the wrist and pulled him downstairs, saying, "Get ready. I want you both gone by tomorrow." Godwin appeared a couple of hours later, swaying as if from exhaustion, his face haggard, but with a faint smile on his lips. Nodding to Marne, who looked at him questioningly, he said, "She'll be all right. I managed to undo the bond, but she'll need rest to recover fully. Let her sleep until the next evening." Receiving an approving smile from the healer, the hunter went to his room and collapsed, falling asleep almost immediately, waving Cale off when he tried to ask questions. They left without waiting for Annabel to wake up. Godwin either snapped at Cale's worried questions or stayed silent, pretending to be either deaf or at least hard of hearing. The hunter's mood was clearly at its worst. He was sullen, constantly frowning and aggressive. During breaks, he worked the novice to exhaustion, mercilessly turning the boy into a punching bag. After a couple of such training sessions, seeing Cale struggling to move his bruised arms, Godwin took pity and gave the boy an herbal concoction to drink, which blissfully relaxed his cramping muscles. The bruises, though still visible on his pale skin, no longer ached incessantly. To the hunter's surprise, the boy endured everything silently and without complaint, stubbornly clenching his teeth when another stinging blow left a red mark on his battered body. In the evenings, Cale, after quickly rinsing off the grime from a day in the saddle and grueling training, would sit beside Godwin with eager eyes, and various efforts would coax him into talking about the hidden world. Initially resistant and silent, the hunter eventually yielded to the boy's curiosity, detailing how to distinguish werewolves from shapeshifters, vampires from dhampirs, and what to do if unlucky enough to encounter a dark lycanthrope, before forcibly sending the youth to bed. Given free rein, Cale would have stayed up until dawn, eagerly absorbing every word. Despite this, Cale had a life full of activity. He woke up with difficulty after the fifth nudge from the disgruntled Godwin, and then spent half the day yawning into his fist, his sleepy gaze fixed on the mane of his chestnut horse, bought by the hunter to replace the gelding lost near the dead city of Adin. Cale remembered telling Godwin that he was without a horse and bracing for a slap and another round of unprintable tirades. But to his great surprise, the man remained silent, and in the morning, as they rode away, the confused newcomer saw a tall, thin-legged horse with a rather restless but friendly disposition. The boy and the horse quickly bonded, and Godwin occasionally noticed Cale petting his favorite's sturdy neck or secretly feeding him a piece of bread. During short stops, the youth diligently wrote everything down in a gradually thickening book. Godwin never asked him about it or tried to see what the novice was writing, though, strangely enough, he sometimes felt curious. On the fourth day, the hunter unilaterally announced that despite having to take a slight detour, they needed to visit the large city of Ravenmoor, where one of the Hunters' Guild branches was located. Though Cale wasn't thrilled about the turn of events, he didn't argue, dutifully guiding his horse after Godwin's black steed. When they rode through the Guild's gates, the boy immediately felt uncomfortable, catching curious glances and noticing seasoned hunters raising their eyebrows and whispering to each other. Godwin seemed oblivious to it all, or perhaps he was just used to it. Dismounting, he curtly ordered Cale to unsaddle and tend to the horses before quickly disappearing through a simple wooden door leading into the two-story building. The boy shrugged sadly and began to unhook the saddlebags when he felt someone standing behind him and turned around. Leaning against the door of a neighboring stall was a dark-haired boy his age, looking at him curiously. Stocky and short, dressed in simple clothes with the Guild's insignia embroidered on the collar of his shirt. An apprentice who had not yet earned his own ring and personal insignia. "Hi," the boy greeted. His voice was bright and clear. "Who are you, and where are you from?" Cale flinched and shrank under the serious gaze of the brown eyes. Saying that he was a novice of the Holy Order would at least mean condemning himself to the boy, who was currently smiling friendly, would recoil from him as if he were a leper, and contempt would appear on the young face already marked by the thin line of a long scar. "You're with Master Godwin, right?" the boy asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Are you his apprentice?" The redhead swallowed and hastily nodded, mentally cursing himself for such a lie. "Wow, that's amazing," his new acquaintance said, whistling in awe. "You're so lucky. I heard he never takes apprentices. Oh, by the way, I'm Eldwood, he said, suddenly remembering to introduce himself and extending his hand. Cale. They exchanged handshakes. So, how's Godwin? What's it like to learn from him? The dark-haired boy asked, mouth slightly open. The novice remembered the training sessions and involuntarily winced as if from a toothache. Eldwood interpreted this in his own way and, laughing, clapped the redhead on the shoulder. They're all like that, he whispered conspiratorially, and then fell silent, looking over Kyle's shoulder. Cale, a heavy hand landed on the novice's shoulder. What did I tell you to do? Finish the task first, then chat with whoever you want. The boy scratched his head as Hess, who had silently approached from behind, gave the apprentice a heavy cuff, glanced at Cale rubbing his much-abused head, and walked away. Eldwood, who had been silent all this time and gazing in admiration at the legend, chuckled quietly and looked sympathetically at Cale. Come join us. We're meeting in the backyard tonight, he invited, then dashed out of the stable, waving goodbye. Cale pulled the saddle off his disgruntled horse and thought that he definitely liked it here, unlike the holy sanctuary, where every newcomer underwent a humiliating initiation ritual. Godwin, hearing the loud call, the man turned around. A short, stocky man with closely cropped chestnut hair was hurrying towards him. Avon, good to see you, Godwin smiled, shaking the outstretched hand firmly. I didn't think I'd run into you here. Avon squinted his light eyes. How about a drink? The hunter pondered for a moment, then nodded, and they headed to the tavern located just behind the guild's gates. The small but tidy hall was relatively quiet. The evening revelry had yet to begin, and the hunters, who made up the majority of the patrons, behaved calmly, conversing quietly, sharing stories of slain beasts, and chuckling softly at amusing incidents. Avon, listen. Godwin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Who checked Adin and its surroundings? My team and Bray's crew. The chestnut-haired hunter looked at him in surprise. Your team didn't go into the city, right? Godwin's voice was even. No, we parted ways at the gates. Avon leaned back in his chair. My group mostly went around the villages, but we found nothing. You're very lucky. Send a messenger to the guild's High Master Thorin. Bray's team no longer exists. And send a burial squad to Adin. Everything left there needs to be burned. What? What are you talking about? Avon asked quietly, his face darkening. The cause was in the city. A high dark witch, a vampire skilled in spider magic, had taken up residence there. Adin has been dead for many years, judging by the state of the bones and buildings. You and your men survived only because she was distracted by Bray's team. The brown-haired hunter remained silent, staring at the man in astonishment and slowly realizing what he had just been told. But I saw it, he exclaimed, striking the table with his fist. I saw that city. It was no different from Ravenmoor. Several people turned at the loud outburst, and Avon quieted down a bit. It was an illusion, Godwin shrugged. I won't even ask how you managed to deal with a high witch who was also a vampire, Avon muttered, calming down. Better not, Godwin grimaced and unconsciously rubbed his chest. Who's the boy with you? Avon asked, taking a large gulp from his tankard. The dark-haired man fell silent for a moment, then reluctantly said, An apprentice. What? Are you serious? Avon was astonished, and then standing up, playfully punched Godwin on the shoulder. That's right, my friend. It's high time you took on an apprentice. Godwin listened to the voices coming from the backyard and led his stallion out of the stable. The boys, chattering excitedly, were telling each other about the creatures they had already hunted and what new skills their mentors had taught them. The apprentices, still very green, didn't yet understand the true nature of the hunt. They didn't understand that soon they would stop sleeping peacefully at night, waking up in cold sweats, reliving the most horrifying moments over and over. They didn't understand that a life like this is a constant struggle with death. Either you kill or you get killed. There's no chance of returning to a normal life, knowing what lurks both in the darkness and in the daylight. He wouldn't wish such a fate on anyone. The hunter saddled his black horse, glancing at Cale's chestnut horse standing calmly in the stall. The novice was among the boasting boys. The hunter's keen ear picked out his timid voice. Godwin had planned to leave him here because, much to his surprise, he realized he didn't want the boy to die. It didn't matter to him what the red-haired youth was. He just didn't want him to face death. So the hunter asked Avon to look after the apprentice until his return. His old friend simply gave him a sympathetic look and nodded in agreement. "I knew it," came a displeased voice from behind as Godwin secured the saddlebags. The hunter turned and frowned at the approaching novice who held the bridled and saddled chestnut horse by the reins. "You're not leaving without me," the boy stubbornly declared, looking at the hunter defiantly. The man was silent for a moment, then shrugged. "If you're in such a hurry to meet your end, I won't stop you." And he turned away, mounting his horse. Kyle, expecting an angry rebuke or even a couple of cuffs, looked puzzled at Godwin's departing back and quickly climbed onto his horse, following the hunter. Once again, the two riders set out on their journey. Once enemies, they had become student and teacher. The road had changed them, changed their perspectives. They had learned to trust each other. But the path remained fraught with dangers. No one knew what lay ahead, what adventures and trials awaited them. Would they be able to maintain their relationship, or would the road change them even more? These questions remained unanswered as they disappeared into the misty distance, where a new chapter of their fate began.